Imagine you're a policymaker in Washington, D.C. You learn that a country has a stockpile of around 200 nuclear weapons. Another has perhaps 10. Which one keeps you up at night? Most leaders would say the second, North Korea, not the first, the United Kingdom. But why? A nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. The missiles themselves are just metal and enriched uranium. The destructive power is objectively similar. So why do we treat them so differently? The mainstream theories of international relations have a hard time answering that question. But constructivism, the focus of this video, offers a clear explanation. For them, what matters in international politics isn't just what states do or possess. It's what those actions and capabilities mean. And this meaning is shaped by identity, ideas, and relationships, not just by numbers or firepower. Constructivism challenges the assumption that global politics is determined solely by material forces like military power or economic capabilities. Instead, constructivists argue that ideas, identities, and norms play a central role in shaping how the international system works. It might be useful to think of constructivism like a bridge. On the one side, it engages with mainstream theories like realism using a shared language of states and anarchy. On the other, though, it focuses on meaning, identity, and discourse and how those shape behavior, and in doing so, it connects with critical theories we'll explore later in the unit, like feminism and post-colonialism. To understand constructivism, we need to ask two foundational questions. What is the world of international relations made of, and how do we know what we know? These are essentially questions of ontology, what exists, and epistemology, how we know. Realism and liberalism tend to treat power, interest, and states as given, fixed material realities. Constructivists disagree. They argue that much of what we take for granted in international politics, sovereignty, threat perceptions, legitimacy, and so on, is socially constructed through interaction and shared belief. This doesn't mean that tanks and missiles aren't real. It means that the meaning of a tank or a missile, whether it signals security or danger, depends on context, identity, and interpretation. Alexander Wendt helped bring constructivism into the IR mainstream with his 1992 article, Anarchy is What States Make of It. Written as a direct challenge to neorealism, Wendt made two core claims. First, that the structures of human association are determined primarily by shared ideas rather than material forces. And second, that the identities and interests of purposive actors are constructed by these shared ideas rather than given by nature. Wendt's core insight is that anarchy, the foundational construct of most mainstream theories of international relations, is not a fixed material structure, it's a social condition. What anarchy means depends on how states interpret it. As he famously put it, anarchy is what states make of it. A world of enemies, in other words, looks very different from a world of friends, even if the distribution of power is the same in both. So, what makes the United States real? Is it the Constitution, the military, the White House? Constructivists would say that the United States exists because people believe it exists, and crucially, because they act on that belief. This is what Wendt refers to as a social fact. Something is real because we collectively agree on it and behave accordingly. If that belief and those behaviors break down, the state itself can begin to disintegrate. In shows like The Last of Us, The Walking Dead, and so on, we see what happens when institutions break down and people no longer act as part of a united national identity. In contrast, in stories like For All Mankind or The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, we see characters and institutions trying to preserve or reinterpret what America means, even amid crisis. Constructivists would say that the state survives not because of its buildings or weapons, but because people continue to believe in and act on a shared identity. The survival of the state, in other words, depends not on its military or its constitution, but on the shared identity of its people. Let's consider a real-world historical example. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. Gorbachev resigned, the Soviet flag was lowered, authority was transferred to the Russian Federation. But why did the USSR collapse? Materialist explanations point to an arms race, economic stagnation, or ethnic divisions. Constructivists don't deny these pressures, but they argue that the key factor was the collapse in collective identity. For them, Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring, opened a space for new ways of thinking. Citizens stopped identifying as Soviets and began identifying and acting as Russians, Ukrainians, Estonians, and so on. The shared belief in the Soviet Union as a political community faded, and as it did, so too did the Union itself. Constructivists argue that national identity also shapes foreign policy. States don't act based only on material interests. They act in ways that align with their self-image. China, for instance, emphasizes sovereignty and territorial integrity. This reflects a historical memory of foreign occupation and humiliation. The United States, by contrast, sees itself as a global promoter of democracy, an identity rooted in manifest destiny and the idea of being a city upon a hill. These identities shape what states value, what they perceive as threats, and what kinds of foreign policies they pursue. Constructivists also highlight the power of norms, which are essentially shared expectations about appropriate behavior. Some prominent international norms today might include the norm against targeting civilians in war, and more broadly, the rules of war, the nuclear taboo, the norm of respecting human rights, and so on. These norms aren't enforced by a global police, but they nevertheless shape and even constrain state behavior. And mainstream theories of international relations, especially realism, have a hard time explaining why. After all, in an anarchic international system, we can't expect states to abide by norms, especially when the national interest is at stake. But constructivists argue that norms can constrain or shape state behavior, even when doing so seems to go against narrow conceptions of national interest. For example, why would South Africa dismantle its nuclear weapons program? Why do so many states abide by the landmine ban, even if such weapons could serve military purposes? The answer lies in the power of shared norms and the desire to maintain legitimacy within the international community. Constructivists argue that one of the most powerful ways international politics is shaped isn't through force or money, but through norms, widely shared expectations about what kinds of behavior are appropriate for certain actors. Where do these norms come from? How do they spread? And how do they become so embedded in global politics that we take them for granted? To answer this question, constructivist scholars like Martha Finnemore and Catherine Sekink developed the norm life cycle, a framework that helps explain how norms emerge, cascade, and become internalized in the international system. The process itself starts with what Finnemore and Sekink call norm entrepreneurs, individuals, organizations, or networks who push for new ideas about how the world should work. These actors aren't always powerful states. Often they're NGOs, activists, or even small countries. Their goal is to reframe an issue and to persuade others that a particular behavior is morally unacceptable. We see this in the 1990s with the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, or the ICBL, which was initially led by activist Jody Williams when she began advocating for the elimination of landmines, arguing that they caused indiscriminate harm long after conflicts had ended. Through storytelling, data, and powerful imagery, like children maimed by leftover mines, the campaign gradually shifted the conversation from military utility to humanitarian disaster. At this stage, success depends on framing. Can norm entrepreneurs convince others that the old way is wrong and that a new standard is necessary? If norm entrepreneurs succeed, these ideas begin to spread. The next stage is the norm cascade, where more and more actors adopt the norm, not necessarily because they're true believers, but because they feel pressure to conform. There are a variety of reasons states might begin to conform to these new norms. Perhaps they're hoping to maintain legitimacy in the international community, or perhaps they just want to strengthen existing alliances or gain international prestige, or perhaps they're just afraid of shame and giving in to peer pressure. Again, we see this play out in the context of landmines. By the mid-1990s, after the ICBL's campaign gained traction, dozens of states, many of whom had never used landmines, began supporting the ban. Eventually, even more military powers like Canada and Germany joined in. The effort culminated with the Ottawa Treaty of 1997, under which 122 signatory countries committed to banning anti-personnel landmines. This norm cascade is the tipping point. As the norm gains momentum, states start joining not only because they're convinced, but because they don't want to be left out. Eventually, a norm can reach a stage where it becomes so widely adopted that it's no longer even questioned. It's just common sense. This is norm internalization. At this point, compliance becomes habitual or automatic. Violating the norm carries not just material consequences, but reputational costs. The norm may be codified in international law, but it doesn't need to be powerful. Again, we can look at the landmine case as an example. Today, landmines are widely regarded as unacceptable weapons of war. While some powerful states like the United States, Russia, and China haven't signed the treaty, they generally still avoid using landmines, in part because of the social stigma attached. The use of landmines, in other words, isn't just a military calculation, it's become a question of legitimacy. Now, it's worth noting that not every norm makes it through all three stages. Some fail to gain traction, others stall out during the cascade stage. Some norms may even regress. For example, the norm against the use of torture was once widely accepted, but after 9/11, some states openly violated, others tacitly approved. This shows that norms are powerful but not invincible. They may be defended, reinforced, and sometimes reinterpreted to survive. International organizations play a central role in spreading and legitimizing norms. Constructivists see institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, or the World Health Organization as more than just platforms for cooperation. They help define what it means to be a modern, legitimate state. They create standards, issue reports, and offer technical guidance. And by doing so, they shape both the behavior and the identity of states. But let's return to our opening question. Currently, the United States maintains a nuclear stockpile of around 5,000 warheads, and Russia has a similar number. China has about 600, France about 300, and the United Kingdom about 200. And from there, the numbers drop off pretty quickly. India and Pakistan have about 200 each, Israel 90, and North Korea has an estimated 50 warheads. Each of these warheads could cause immense damage, easily destroying a city like New York or San Francisco. But why is it that we view North Korea's small nuclear stockpile as an existential crisis to the security of the United States, but express no concern over the United Kingdom's or France's much larger stockpiles? Why is the United States so much more preoccupied with the threat posed by Iran's potential development of nuclear weapons than with Israel's actual possession of them? Wendt offers a possible explanation. According to him, states act differently towards enemies than they do towards friends because enemies are threatening and friends are not. Nothing too controversial so far, but he continues, anarchy and the distribution of power are insufficient to tell us which is which. U.S. military power has a different significance for Canada than for Cuba, despite their similar structural positions, just as British missiles have a different significance for the United States than do Soviet missiles. The distribution of power may always affect a state's calculation, but how it does so depends on the intersubjective understandings and expectations, on the distribution of knowledge that constitutes their conception of self and others. If the United States and the Soviet Union decide they are no longer enemies, the Cold War is over. It is collective meanings that constitute these structures which organize our actions. A branch of constructivism called securitization theory examines how issues become threats. According to this theory, something becomes a security issue not because of its objective danger, but because powerful actors frame it that way. This framing is usually referred to as a speech act, and we see them pretty regularly in international politics. Examples of such speech acts might include framing immigration as an invasion, framing climate change as a national security threat, or framing COVID-19 as an existential threat. In the introduction to his classic text Writing Security, David Campbell observes that danger is not an objective condition. It is not a thing which exists independently of those to whom it may become a threat. This understanding of the necessarily interpretive basis of risk has important implications for international relations. It does not deny that there are real dangers in the world. Infectious diseases, accidents, and political violence, among other factors, have consequences that can literally be understood in terms of life and death. But not all risks are equal, and not all risks are interpreted as dangers. Modern society contains within it a veritable cornucopia of danger. Indeed, there is such an abundance of risk that it is impossible to objectively know all that threatens us. Those events or factors which we identify as dangerous, therefore, come to be ascribed as such only through interpretation of their various dimensions of dangerousness. Moreover, that process of interpretation does not depend upon the incidence of objective factors for its veracity. In other words, as securitization theory reminds us, threats are not discovered, they're constructed. One of constructivism's greatest strengths is its ability to explain change in international politics. Where realism and liberalism tend to assume that state interests are stable and fixed, driven by survival or economic gain, constructivism sees interests as constructed. That means they can evolve, especially when people or movements challenge existing norms and identities. Constructivists argue that individuals, social movements, and non-state actors all play powerful roles in shaping how we understand the world. Acting as norm entrepreneurs, these actors introduce new ideas about what's right, just, or possible in global politics. Consider 3 recent examples. Greta Thunberg didn't discover climate science. Instead, she reframed climate change as a moral issue of intergenerational justice. By mobilizing youth identity and using blunt emotional appeals at forums like the United Nations, she helped shift climate discourse from abstract science to ethical urgency. After surviving an attack by the Taliban, Malala Yousafzai became a global symbol of resistance. Her advocacy moved beyond a demand for access to education. It positioned girls' education as a universal human right. That framing changed how international organizations and governments justified policy interventions. And indigenous activists around the world are contesting the legitimacy of colonial-era borders and legal systems, asserting traditional sovereignty and reframing international law as a product of historical injustice, and thereby introducing alternative ways of understanding statehood, territory, and legitimacy. In each case, shared understandings shifted, demonstrating that global politics isn't just shaped by tanks and treaties, but by language, identity, and imagination. That said, constructivism isn't without its critics. Scholars from positive traditions or rationalist traditions often argue that constructivist concepts like identity and norms are too fuzzy to be tested systematically. If everything is socially constructed, how do we know what causes what? But constructivists reply that understanding meaning and identity requires interpretation. Not everything important can be measured with numbers. Social facts are real, just not in the same way as material facts are. Think of the difference between explaining a country's gross domestic product and explaining why a state believes its borders are sacred. Both matter, but only one can be captured in a spreadsheet. Realists also argue that when crisis hits, war, invasion, or existential threat, states will fall back on material interests and security regardless of norms or identities. For example, international law and norms didn't prevent the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq or Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. But for their part, constructivists argue that even these actions were justified through appeals to identity and legitimacy. The United States framed its invasion as defending democracy, and Russia claimed to be protecting Russian speakers. Thus, even power politics rely on socially constructed narratives. Constructivists, in other words, don't deny power, they ask how power is understood and legitimized. Another critique is that constructivism can only explain how things happened after the fact. It's less helpful in predicting future behavior. By focusing on meanings and relationships, constructivists often struggle to make generalizable claims. But constructivists argue that even if their approach is more interpretive than predictive, it can still help anticipate change by showing where identities and norms are shifting, and it offers tools for understanding how new threats or norms might emerge. Realism and liberalism often rely on the logic of consequence. Actors weigh costs and benefits to maximize utility. Constructivism adds the logic of appropriateness, with actors guided by identity and behavioral expectations. Thus, while constructivism may not offer neat formulas or predictions, it nevertheless adds something essential. It helps us understand the meaning of power, identity, and legitimacy, and how that shapes international behavior. And as global politics becomes more contested and multipolar, understanding norms, ideas, and identities is indispensable.